Can Britain become an AI tech giant? The COVID blame game. And should Britain apologise for its colonial past? This is... Joining me, Conservative MP Stephen Hammond, Labour MP Stella Creasy, the political editor of The Sun, Harry Cole, and the New Statesman's Harry Lambert. On today's programme, the expletive-ridden WhatsApp message from Dominic Cummings, directed towards a senior civil servant, is read out at the COVID inquiry.
I don't care how it's done, but that woman must be out of our hair. We cannot keep dealing with this horrific meltdown of the British state while dodging stilettos from that.
This morning, that civil servant Helen McNamara speaks.
It wasn't in any doubt in my mind at that point that we were heading for a total disaster.
In Gaza, the Rafah crossing with Egypt opens for the badly injured and foreign nationals.
Oh God, my 3 kids are gone. I hope I can find one alive. I didn't say goodbye.
But as the death toll mounts, can Western governments resist pressure for a ceasefire?
The wrongdoings of the past are a cause of the greatest sorrow and the deepest regret.
The King acknowledges Britain's colonial legacy on a state visit to Kenya. But is it enough? This campaigner wants Britain to apologise for the killing of more than 10,000 Kenyans in the 1950s.
If I lift up the cover and show you the interior, if you count up, you'll find that this device has got 12 wheels in it.
And can an artificial intelligence conference at Bletchley Park, the home of the World War II codebreakers, make Britain great at tech again? Well, let's start with that conference because political leaders are gathering at Bletchley Park. It's hosted by the government, and Bletchley Park, as you know, is testament to our rich history and success in computer science. The opening question for our panel today is, can we do the same with artificial intelligence?
I think we can. I mean, we have shown that we are one of the world's leaders in developing tech. I think the key question for Britain is, we've got brilliant researchers. Can we take that research, make that into a product which we then manufacture and then use for the economy? And the question mark, I think, is how do you expand that and how does Britain make sure they have companies that can do that? Right. Stella, can we make it a commercial success here in the UK?
Look, in theory, we could do anything, and certainly one of the things is for the world to learn perhaps the mistakes around social media where we didn't act quickly enough to set out what should happen with these new technologies. I think the challenge here is, what can the UK do? Because we're not part of, obviously, the conversations that the Americans are doing, and I'm very conscious that Kamala Harris is about to go and announce an institute while she's here as well, and an American institute to try and lead this debate, because it's an international debate. The Europeans are very close to actually having legislation on this, and we're not in either of those 2 rooms. And for me, it is a function of Brexit that we are not at the table in the way that we should be. Now, it's great that we're having this conference in Bletchley Park. Everybody wants us to be part of it, but the brutal reality is it's going to be much harder to have that influence on what the regulations are and the way in which the world approaches these things when we're not part of those conversations to begin with.
What do you say in response to that, Harry?
Well, I'd say von der Leyen's in Bletchley Park last time I checked at the British Summit, as is the
Commission
Vice President of the United States. Look, I do wonder, on a slightly separate note, whether spending the entire week talking about AI to our readers makes the government look a little bit out of touch.
Oh, really?
I would just point, perhaps, you can do these things without it dominating the entire government's bandwidth, which it appears to be doing.
Well, it's a big moment, clearly, for Rishi Sunak.
Big moment for Rishi Sunak. Never seen the guy look more relaxed and comfortable than in his tech bro speech last week. He loves this stuff. He absolutely adores it. That's great. But let's all keep it slightly in perspective. This is slightly further down the line. There's lots of day-to-day issues that I think some people might think that this is perhaps taking a little bit too much of the government's time. That said, I disagree with Stella in the fact that, this is a unique position that the UK government is in, is that we are actually the 3rd largest tech sector on AI after the Americans and the Chinese. Europe, would love to get onto our silicon roundabouts rather than valleys, perhaps. That said, I do think we have a unique position to be a bridge between perhaps the over-regulating EU, which is first instinct, as you say, is to draw up legislation and red tape and try and hamper creativity. The United States have set out their own charter. Maybe there's a third way which we can sort of bridge between the two, of being a bit more nimble, a bit more attractive to business. We have guidelines and guide rails rather than bogging it down in law.
Do you think we can be the nimble third way?
Well, hang on a minute. I mean, we actually host arguably the most successful AI company in the world, which is DeepMind. I mean, Demis Hassabis is a British entrepreneur. He is, along with Sam Altman at OpenAI, the key figure in AI. So we have a thriving AI tech sector. The problem is it's not British owned. They had to sell themselves to Google to get the money they needed. We're not going to do anything about that. That's just the reality of the situation. On Harry's point, look, Rishi Sunak loves AI. He's probably readying his exit plan. He'd quite like to work in that world after he leaves office next year.
We'll leave that question hanging. Let's talk about the COVID inquiry, which today has been hearing from Helen McNamara, the second most senior civil servant in the country during the pandemic. Now, it follows a pretty explosive day of evidence yesterday, namely from Boris Johnson's closest aides, Dominic Cummings and Lee Cain. Let's have a look at how the papers are covering it, some of them anyway. Daily Mail. Now Cummings feels the heat is their front page. But if we roll onto the Daily Telegraph, Cummings fed toxic misogynist culture in number 10. Clear where and who they are blaming. But we have a look at the front page of the Mirror. Boris, the old should accept their fate. Who is to blame? Is it Dominic Cummings or is it Boris Johnson, Harry?
I think the evidence we're seeing today, yesterday, and in fact over the last couple of weeks in this inquiry is pretty fascinating. In the fact that even though you've got Helen McNamara today, the appalling sexist pig Dominic Cummings is, and we're not learning anything new from the COVID inquiry on that front. You only had to have met him over the last few years to realise what the character you were dealing with. Park all the tittle-tattle aside, actually you've got Helen McNamara and Dominic Cummings both agreeing that the Department of Health basically lied at the beginning of COVID and said, yeah, we've got this great plan. They were assuring number 10. Feed into that, you've got one of the more, shall we say, optimistic politicians of the age who would rather things, were sunny and happy, but who's being told all along in the preparation to this, everything's going to be fine. We've got a world-beating plan.
I'm just going to interject in just now, in fact, because Helen McNamara is responding to some of the fury and those expletive-laden WhatsApp messages that were directed at her. Let's have a listen.
The things that Mr. Cummings, having seen those messages, it was, it's horrible to read, but it is both surprising and not surprising to me, and I don't know which is worse, actually.
Well, that was Helen McNamara. She was responding to the message, or part of the message you heard in the headlines. He also said, Dominic Cummings, in that WhatsApp message, that she should be handcuffed and escorted out of Downing Street. I mean, when listening to the sort of exchanges, you say it's tittle-tattle, Harry, but Harry Lambert, the toxic culture that was clearly evident right at the heart of government is quite shocking.
Absolutely, and the fact that the Prime Minister allowed an advisor to speak like that and kept him on, Boris Johnson has to take responsibility here. He's the person that hired Dominic Cummings. He's the person that didn't challenge these plans that Harry talks about. But I do think, in terms of Cummings himself, just quickly, this is a comment that's going to rightfully hound him and haunt him from here on out. And he always... there's always talk of him returning to British politics, and I think this is the death knell of him being again involved in British political life. Just
on the point, I was the point of saying we're not necessarily learning new information about Dominic Cummings there. There is, I'd say, bigger structural problems being exposed by this inquiry, and I do wonder whether actually it is perhaps too... it's the first time this inquiry has been on the front pages in weeks, as far as I can remember. But actually, we've been learning throughout this some quite shocking failings of the entire British state, from the political side to the civil service side. And actually, I do wonder whether we are focusing too much on the personalities and not on the problems.
Right. I mean, do you agree with that? I mean, for you, what has it told you? What have these exchanges told you about what was going on at the heart of government?
Told me a number of things. The first thing it's told me is that, I was health minister for a while, and we did look at the risk register, the two most senior politicians and the two most senior civil servants, plus NHS England. The problem was that what was on the risk register was not COVID, it was a SARS type. And therefore, I wasn't there because Boris sacked me to know what they said about the plan at the time.
So do you blame Boris Johnson? Do you blame Boris Johnson for what is being revealed, which is this dysfunctional government?
Yeah, because in the end, the man who is at the top of the government, he appointed these advisors, he created some of that toxic environment. His very nature meant that one of the reasons why he was a success at London was that he had people that stopped him getting involved in a lot of the day-to-day dealings, and he had competent deputy mayors. The problem here is he was at the head of the government at a time when anybody and any state, as we've seen, faced a crisis that was almost no one had prepared for properly across Europe. And his particular skill set, and the one thing I agree with Lee Kane, doesn't make that work because he's too optimistic.
Right, should we trust the Conservative Party to actually vote for, elect leaders who are appropriate for these sorts of crises?
Well, I think that if you look at the last 15 years, Jo, you've seen 3 once-in-a-lifetime crises. The financial crisis, you've seen Brexit, and you've seen this. I think the one thing you can say is now that the Conservative Party has a leader who you can be sure has integrity and has the intelligence to question whether or not the right course of action is being taken.
Yes.
Except he was in the room the entire time with all of these
he
conversations.
was in the room at some of the time, but not the entire time.
Look,
I don't think anyone's going to question his
integrity
integrity stuff.
Here because, frankly, what I see is that this is an extreme example of that toxic misogynistic culture, but it's not the only one across government and across politics. And what you see, it's not tittle-tattle, because the culture in which people were making decisions and looking at issues, there's open hostility and then there's all the unconscious bias. As somebody who was in some of the conversations with MPs trying to raise issues about care homes, at one point I was trying to raise issues about why on earth weren't we dealing with pregnant women and whether they should access the vaccine. Those systematic and systemic problems where women's voices and any kind of human thinking and EQ was denied, how we got to a point where people were talking about herd immunity and the numbers of people who should be expected to take risks with their families' lives without anybody challenging it. It's not just about the COVID crisis.
They were being challenged.
Gents, I'm trying to speak.
Sorry.
Let's not.
Finish your point. But
it's also the point is it's not just about COVID. It's about that broader way in which we make decisions in government, what we consider to be leadership, and what we look for in people. You've talked about 3 different examples. Every single time we've seen this kind of thinking and this kind of behaviour.
I don't think
you cannot tell me, Stephen, that the same questions about how decisions were made around the Brexit deal and this kind of bully boy. There's a very obscene term that I would use.
I think the difference here isn't the difference, Stella, here, the language that's being used, which is unforgivable and misogynistic. And as Harry said, we saw Mr. Cummings and his character come out fully revealed in this. And some of us who've met him on other occasions probably expected that to happen.
And has it led to bad decisions as a result?
Clearly, bad decisions were made in the pandemic, but that is apparent. We know we don't necessarily need an inquiry of £1 million a week to tell us that one. We knew that at the time.
But women's voices missing being part of that.
Well, yes, I'm sure of that. I have no doubt about that. But also, the problem is, you say that Rishi Sunak was there in the room. Yes, he was, but he was raising concerns on behalf of the Treasury about the economy. You had Boris Johnson also. This idea that basically the problem I have with the tone of the inquiry so far is it appears to have decided that lockdown was the right answer. It appears to have decided already that we didn't lock down soon enough. That's probably true if we were going to do it. But there doesn't seem to be any stressing of the actual decisions made. It's all about the process of what the decisions, how they got to them. But actually, I would like the inquiry, like it's being done in other countries, to look at, did we get the decisions right? Yes, let's look at how they're made. But on the big scale of things, we're still recovering from lockdown. The economy is still in the absolute toilet because of lockdown. Was it the right decision? We don't seem to be talking about that. We seem to be talking about how we got to the decision of lockdown.
We know one decision that was an error, which was eat out to help out, which at the time advisors,
That was Rishi Sunak.
Exactly, and he's the Prime Minister. You had Obama-era economic advisors saying it'd be better to pour money into the English Channel than to come up with that plan. So we know that was a foolish idea. And also, I think we do need to say, Jeremy Hunt who was Health Secretary in the 2010s, and a whole generation of politicians really didn't anticipate a pandemic. That plan that you talk about, that describes hundreds of thousands of people dying. And they never thought through the consequences of that. So, you know, we always had this idea that a pandemic was going to sweep across the nation. We wouldn't be able to do anything about that. And I think that was always a faulty assumption.
Sorry, can I just put to Stephen, though, do you agree with Harry that Rishi Sunak is culpable in this too? He may not have been in the room for all the decisions, but he was responsible for that scheme. Eat out to help out.
He was responsible for that scheme. But what I'm saying is, I think, is that Sunak, you asked the question, can you trust the Conservative to elect a leader? I think we have now elected a leader who overcomes some of the issues of integrity, and clearly because he is a man of integrity. There are huge numbers. I agree with Harry. I think that one of the questions...
It's taken a few goes, though, to get to Rishi Sunak, hasn't it?
Well, I'm not going to disagree with that. But hold on. But I am going to also agree with Harry that this should be an inquiry about lessons of both Harrys to a certain extent. But I will question the point about the plan in a moment. This should be an inquiry where we're looking at lessons learned. It shouldn't be a prosecution of particular people.
I want to come on to
we aren't doing that at the moment.
I want to come on to what you have said about what are we blaming people for in just a moment. But I want to hear a little bit more from Helen McNamara because of your point about, you know, voices in the room being ignored, the misogynistic culture, because she was asked about some of her comments in the early days of COVID, well, the very early days, March 2020.
Express your view that I have come through here to the Prime Minister's office to tell you all I think we're absolutely
It was a sense of foreboding, like I hope nobody sitting in that office ever has that again. Actually, it was a very, very scary experience, but I felt that it wasn't in any doubt in my mind at that point that we were heading for a total disaster.
I mean, pretty scary stuff that then she knew already, Helen McNamara, that the UK, in her words, was heading for a disaster. She doesn't actually say what the disaster precisely is, whether it's number of deaths or whatever it is, but we were heading for a disaster.
Yeah, and I think, look, sorry, I'm going to go back to Rishi Sunak was in the room. It's not just about whether he's challenging on behalf of the Treasury. Was he challenging the way in which decisions were being made? Was he challenging and asking why are so few different voices in this room? What information are we basing this on? Because actually there's no other sector of public life where this level of uniformity, we talk about groupthink, we saw it with the Bay of Pigs, that'll be a historical example. The brutal reality is too few people were empowered to speak up and then come up with solutions, and the consequences are being paid for by
was the group think what Harry said, which was we shouldn't lock down kids.
To play the devil's advocate here, Rishi Sunak did bring in alternative voices on the firebreak in September 2021. That basically Rishi Sunak flew back from California to avoid Britain going back into another lockdown. He was the alternative voice, and he did bring in alternative epidemiologists and experts, and this inquiry has savaged him for it. So the idea that, you know, I think we kind of agree here.
Two different things.
I don't think we are, because I think the
let him finish.
Broadening out the debate didn't happen in the early days. That was the problem, that there was too much reliance on Sage and John Edmonds and Neil Ferguson. And actually, if there'd been more voices, I totally agree, more voices in the room, and if those voices hadn't been hounded throughout the following few years of anyone that basically raised any scepticism of whether lockdown and its implications on the economy were suddenly how murderers with blood on their hands, which these people were called, maybe we could have had a bit more success in protecting the economy and protecting the country.
For avoidance of doubt, I meant different. I mean, literally sitting in those rooms and going, why are we all so alike? Why are we all from similar backgrounds? Why are we only picking on a very small group of people?
But not diversity of thought.
So, well, the two come together.
Right.
I mean, that's the challenge here. So, I mean, that's what I'm saying. You can't say, well, Rishi Sunak played his part in a very small part of this. He was at a senior leadership level. If he had said, actually, can you stop talking over the women in the room, please? That would have changed the conversation. I'm not sure there's any evidence that he ever did that. And often, frankly, as women who do speak out, we need men to do that, because otherwise we're labelled as difficult. We're not difficult, we're different. We've needed different voices in this, and that it matters in this inquiry because it is also about how government works. You know, if we're going to learn from this about future crisis moments, and for example, the crisis we're seeing in the Middle East, cool heads, different perspectives, people who can connect and empathise with people should be part of the conversation.
Right.
That's not just about men versus women, it's about the diversity of people who are affected by things.
But then to take that thought further, was there enough diversity of thought in terms of the questions that were being asked and challenged and now in this inquiry? Or is this inquiry primarily about the people who lost tragically, relatives and family members. Rather than looking at why kids miss school, should they have missed as much school? Should we have locked down earlier, or maybe not at all? Those questions.
I think those questions will come out. It's early days in the inquiry. It's going to be an extensive thing. And I don't agree with Harry that, you know, it's in some way a mistake to take our time over it. I mean, Stella's asking much deeper, broader questions about the makeup of government. And, you know, we know what the diversity of the Tory party is like. Not that I necessarily agree that if people come from different backgrounds, they'll think differently. You can easily have ideological conformity with a bunch of people who look different. So, I mean, the dangers of
that was what Dominic Cummings advertised for, didn't he? He put out adverts for the people he felt would be clever. On his blog, for people who wanted to apply for the jobs, he explicitly said, and absolutely, those people at the top need to take responsibility for having employed people to put them in that position of responsibility to make that happen. I'm just saying there are also things that all these people could have done in the room to say, why are we missing those voices? Because it's not like those voices weren't trying to speak in other forums.
All right, we're going to talk about the Israel-Gaza situation because this morning, and we'll show you pictures of opening up of the Rafah crossing. It's the crossing from southern Gaza into Egypt. It's opened for the first time, and you can see here people flooding out. They include foreign nationals approved by both Egypt and Israel, and also the most seriously injured, unsurprisingly, people hurrying through to leave Gaza. And that's obviously because of aerial bombardments and ground incursion by Israeli defence forces, because yesterday there was an Israeli airstrike which hit a refugee camp in northern Gaza, in the Jabalia camp. Now, Israel says it has taken out a senior Hamas commander, but there are reports of dozens of civilian casualties too. You can see the devastation and the crater, because by attacking and targeting what Israel says is the terrorist network of Hamas underground, those tunnels, buildings on top have collapsed, and many of those buildings, of course, contain civilians. Harry Lambert, watching those images, they're very difficult to watch day on day. And yet, Western governments, many of them, are still saying there is no cause for a ceasefire because it would allow Hamas to, again, stockpile weapons and perhaps regroup. What do you make of it?
I think it's true that a ceasefire only does one thing: it freezes the current conflict, as Keir Starmer says yesterday. And so whether in Ukraine or in Israel, if you're calling for a ceasefire, you're saying you're content with where things are right now. I don't think that should be the case in Ukraine. It means a fifth of the country would be under Russian subjugation. And I think it's untenable to expect the Israelis not to try and remove Hamas from the Gaza Strip. The way they're going about it is not something that I think you can easily condone. There's clearly a tragedy, a humanitarian one, happening here, but it's impossible to call for a ceasefire.
It's impossible to call for a ceasefire, but you are calling for that, Stella. Here is your tweet. The international community must not wait and watch, but use all its influence to stop further violence in Israel and Gaza. That includes asking those like Qatar to act, as they have elsewhere, to help those civilians currently held hostage by Hamas. Why is Harry wrong?
So, look, I think there is more agreement than everybody wants to recognise here. We all want to see the bloodshed stop.
Of course.
And that should be a given here. So the question isn't whether a ceasefire is desirable, it's whether it's actually possible in any meaningful sense. And where I think you're right to challenge people like me who said, no, look, we've got to find a way. Not just, I would never support a ceasefire just involving Israel. I've spent the last 3 weeks working with families who've had members taken hostage by Hamas. I've been trying to get constituents out of Gaza who sadly I fear aren't in that queue of people. So I feel this very acutely. We've got to make sure that we stop the bloodshed. It's absolutely horrific. The 8,000 Palestinian lives lost, the rockets still going into southern Israel. It's all got to stop. But the question is whether that is possible and who might be the actors to be able to do that. All of us recognise ultimately there is no military end point to this. There is going to have to be a diplomatic
So why have you called for a ceasefire?
Including in that the dismantling of Hamas.
Sure, but why have you called for a ceasefire then?
Because I think, what I've said is it's in the interests of all the people in the region to work towards a ceasefire. So what are the conditions that would make that happen.
So not have a ceasefire now?
No. Look, I want to see a ceasefire as quickly as possible, but it's
as quickly
whether
as
it's
possible, again, is not now.
And that's where the question, rightly, you should be challenging people like me to say, OK, how do you make that happen? What I think is that the conversations with the Qataris, the Saudi Arabians, the pressure that can be brought to bear about what Hamas do, about the release of the hostages. And I just say this, you know, the woman who you did see get released 2 weeks ago, she was the mother of one of my constituents, an extraordinary woman, Yocheved Lifshitz. And she pushed and she said, what I think a lot of people in Israel are saying on the ground is that there are a range of views here about what people want the Israeli government to do.
But can we just, because language is important, as we all know, and there is a big difference between calling for a ceasefire right now and trusting that Hamas will do the same, and calling for a humanitarian pause, which is what Keir Starmer and the government are calling for. And you think they're wrong to call for a humanitarian pause? They should call right now for a ceasefire.
No, I think we want the bloodshed to stop. That stops when the missiles stop. It stops when the hostages are returned.
You just answered your point there.
Yes.
The bloodshed stops when the missiles stop.
Yes.
But what evidence is there? What evidence since 2007 has there been that there's any diplomatic way through this? There's not. There are terrorists. There are terrorist groups.
2007 is your date of, because I mean actually we have one of the challenges.
But they haven't. They've used that time and that money to build the tunnel network, which then Hamas are now using to conduct a war against Israel. What evidence do we have realistically that the Qataris are going to have a breakthrough? The UN's a basket case. The Americans accept this. We accept this. What possible evidence is there that these terrorists are going to obey a ceasefire? So what you're saying is stop bombing Gaza, fine, noble position, but you've got to accept and be honest about what that means, which is Gazan lives are more valuable than Israeli lives because the rockets are going to keep coming and they're going to keep coming and they're not going to stop. And any diplomatic pause is playing into Hamas's hands.
Harry, should we just all agree that all innocent lives are worth protecting?
But you're basically saying terrorists get a free pass.
Right now you've got women having caesarean sections without anaesthetic in Gaza, right? It is a horrific, brutal situation. There are no winners in all of this.
No, I totally agree with you.
Let me bring.
But how are you going to stop Hamas firing the rockets?
Yeah, but does there come a point at which, looking at pictures like that and the death toll mounting of Palestinian civilians day in, day out, becomes intolerable for people to watch, even bearing in mind Hamas and the massacre in southern Israel and the kidnapped hostages?
We are all horrified by the pictures we see, and I think there's universal agreement about that. The question is, how do you stop that in the long term and assure a lasting peace? And I think the government, and to his credit, Keir Starmer, are right, particularly the government is right to talk about a humanitarian pause, to allow more aid to get in, to allow more people to get out. But it is absolutely clear that a ceasefire now would do nothing more than stop where we are. It would not ensure a lasting peace. The lasting peace will only come when Hamas either accepts that it can no longer fulfill its aim of destroying the state of Israel, or you see other actors in the region working with Hamas.
What is a humanitarian pause?
Well, humanitarian
pause.
Yes, what is a pause?
All right, humanitarian pause could be 24 hours or 48 hours to allow more humanitarian aid in than we've seen at the moment because of the number of lorries going in. It could be that it allows more humanitarian aid to come into the sea as France proposed.
If Harry's right, and there's no point in even trying to use the influence that the Qataris have with Hamas, what record have you got that Hamas would abide by a pause?
Well, I totally agree.
Actually, this is dancing on a pinhead. What matters here is
it's diplomatic fudge and fig-leafing.
No, it doesn't. It matters here that we start to say, how can we get through this? Because
we had a ceasefire, and that was broken by Hamas on October. So there is absolutely no guarantee that all the calling for the ceasefire will now stop any of the violence.
Right. David Lammy today. Well, David Lammy has said that he needs at least 4 or 5 days of a humanitarian pause to get enough of those lorries that have been stationed in Egypt for several weeks to get into Gaza to reach civilians that are running out of all the sort of vital utilities. But there is no doubt that pressure is growing on Western governments. Let's just show you this. This is Antony Blinken testifying about the White House's national security funding request for both Ukraine and for Gaza. But let's have a look.
Not in the face of Russia's aggression against Ukraine. Not in the face of an intensifying strategic competition in the Indo-Pacific and around the world.
Committee will suspend. testimony.
Now, I mean, protesters there behind Anthony Blinken, they had to suspend that sitting. As I say, he was talking about agreeing finance for both the war that's going on between Russia and Ukraine and also Israel-Gaza. I mean, it's interesting seeing protests here. Again, people do have that right to protest, don't they, even if governments are not, at the moment, bending to their calls for a ceasefire.
Yeah, I think we just need to zoom out a bit here. Like, this is about how we deal with this issue domestically. Keir Starmer's position, Rishi Sunak's position, it's not going to have any impact in Israel. Even Joe Biden's position isn't going to have a lot of impact in Israel right now. You know, they're carrying out their own war. We can get specific about exactly what they should be doing, shouldn't be. But just to talk about this,
yes.
You know, the key issue is there are a lot of people in this country who feel very strongly about this conflict. And that's,
not just here.
Well, of course, all over the world. But, I mean, that's the job for politicians. It's to find the line that maintains community relations.
Right, and is that line being crossed by some of the protesters and protests, or is Suella Braverman out of order by calling pro-Palestinian marches, most of them peaceful, hate marches?
Well, she's usually out of order. But I think let's look at the responsible politicians here. I mean, Keir Starmer took, I think, too strong a position early on when he was live on air on LBC by saying Israel had the right to restrict aid. He then modified that position, as he tends to do, as he got a bit more information and worked out where the public were. And he's not a conviction politician, but he usually gets to the right sort of position, and I think he has on this issue.
Right. Do you accept Suella Braverman's language? Was that justifiable to call pro-Palestinian demonstrations hate marches?
People have the right to protest. They have the right to protest peacefully. I think what she was raising, and I may not have described it in quite the same way, but what she was raising is that there were people protesting which clearly contravene the current rules of this country about hate crime and inciting hatred and community disquiet. And some of the comments that are being made about Israel and Jews on some of those marches were clearly unacceptable.
And are they hate marches?
We should say that people have the right to protest, your right to talk. If you want to say that you believe in the Palestinian cause, of course, if you do that peacefully, you do not have the right to incite community violence.
Right. Are they hate marches?
I think that what she has said, she is right to express the concern that some of the people on those marches were contravening the current laws about hate crime.
Right, well, let's show you these pictures at Liverpool Street Station. A large number, I have to say, I don't know how many, but thousands, in a sit-in at Liverpool Street Station. They're calling for a ceasefire, but many in the Jewish community, or the Jewish community maybe as a whole, feels very intimidated by this sort of crowd chanting ceasefire, or in other marches, Free Palestine. Do they go too far?
I've had Jewish residents contact me about that. It's one of our local stations, and they were terrified. And I think it's important to draw a distinction between people who want to express, because they're seeing these horrific images and they just want politicians to find an easy way through it, and people using phrases like river to the sea, some of whom I don't think understand which river is being talked about, which are clearly inflammatory. I have appealed to people, if you are going to say you want to march for peace, if you want to stop the bloodshed, talk about all innocent civilians. So stand with those people demanding that the hostages.
So you've talked to people about the way,
absolutely. Look, it's happening in my local community too. All of us have a responsibility to dial down this, but we also all have a responsibility to look at whether it is possible. And I'm not with Harry, because history teaches us that there are difficult diplomatic processes that have reaped results, whether in Northern Ireland, for example, which have involved difficult conversations. None of that can happen. And one of the things I worry about is
the IRA did some terrible things. They didn't put babies in ovens and kidnap and rape and murder children and burn them. That comparison, I think, is a little...
And let's be careful of the comparisons.
A line was crossed.
End point? I speak as somebody who has stood up for, who is working with people directly affected by this now, and all of us want this to stop, right? All of us want to see a safe Israel, want to see Jewish people in our communities not frightened. I've seen horrific anti-Semitism in my local schools.
I agree.
Okay? How do we actually get there?
By eradicating
Hamas
from Gaza. It is a safe space for terrorists right now, and if you have a ceasefire and you allow them to regroup, you will make it a safe space for terrorists for decades to come. A line was crossed on the 7th of October.
Let him finish.
It is beyond the pale, it is an outrage, and it needs to be something needs to be done about it. What you're saying is that Israel essentially has no right to defend itself.
Harry, that
if you
is
are
not
calling
what
for a
I'm saying
ceasefire,
at
you
all.
are saying, take
Harry,
it on the chin, guys,
no.
let it go.
Harry, that's offensive, and that's not what I'm saying.
That is what
I
the implication
is.
Well, she has a right to reply.
To recognise. I mean, and frankly, there's the wider regional context that even if you dismantle Hamas, which I've said needs to happen, what happens with Iran? What happens, with a piece of paper?
You're not going to do it through a diplomatic solution. You're going to do it from the air.
How do you want it to happen?
How do you see it happening, Harry? And how do you see safety? And I mean, I don't know whether you agree with a two-state solution. I do. I want to see a free Palestine. I want to see a secure Israel. So how do you get there?
It's not going to be done by sucking up to the Qataris. It's going to be done by force.
You can't answer that
Let's talk.
It's going to be done by force.
We're going to talk about something completely different. We're going to talk about the royal visit to Kenya. Let's show you pictures of King Charles and his wife, Queen Camilla. They're on a 4-day state visit to Kenya. It's the first to the country since he became monarch. And he gave a speech addressing the wrongdoings of Britain's colonial era. Let's have a listen to some of it.
The wrongdoings of the past are a cause of the greatest sorrow and the deepest regret. There were abhorrent and unjustifiable acts of violence committed against Kenyans as they waged, as you said at the United Nations, a painful struggle for independence and sovereignty. And for that, there can be no excuse.
King Charles there stopped short of issuing an apology, a full apology. We can talk now to Cornelius Oduor, Deputy Executive Director of Kenya Human Rights Commission. He joins us from Nairobi. Hello to you. You heard what King Charles said. Is that enough?
That is not enough, and we are really disappointed that he fell short of issuing a public apology, contrary to the expectation of majority of Kenyans. And this follows in the very pattern that we've seen the British take to run away from responsibility. But we'll continue pushing as Kenya Human Rights because we strongly feel this is the right thing to do. And now that he's in Kenya, it will be a wonderful opportunity for him to make this statement.
Cornelius, what do you exactly want King Charles to apologise for?
You are all aware that in an attempt to establish his rule in Kenya, there are so many gross human rights violations meted on resistance groups that were resisting the establishment of British rule in Kenya since 1895 to 1963 when he got independence. And this has not been addressed fully. There are so many people who lost their lives, and to date, there has been no comprehensive response or reparation to talk about.
During the Mau Mau uprising in the 1950s.
Exactly. This happened, and during the emergency, so many people lost their lives. But you understand that what we are talking about draws back from 1895 up to that period. And the Mau Mau was just one of those many episodes that the British colonial rule did exact gross violations of human rights in Kenya.
Cornelius, stay with us for the discussion. Stephen, what's your response, particularly to the idea of King Charles making a full apology for all of the wrongdoings committed during the colonial era?
Well, I think you heard a very full expression of regret. You said that he said that the actions were unacceptable, and I would have thought that the sensible thing would be to say that is a very fulsome expression of regret by our head of state to the Kenyan state, and I would have hoped that we could have said that is the expression that you should have been looking for, and we should move on.
Right. Why shouldn't he apologise then? I mean, if he's making that expression of regret in the way he did, why not apologise fully?
But what are we asking to express an apology for? The whole period, a particular incident, everywhere in the world, British history. I mean, I think that what he did was to address very directly and express his sorrow at the actions of a particular issue, and that was the right thing to do. The question, and I think his words, you could have seen that they were emotional and heartfelt, And I think that is the right way forward.
I mean, Stella, even if the King did want to apologise, he would have his hands tied to a certain extent because, as always on such occasions, it's made on government advice. But what's your position? Should the government apologise if Labour wins the next election?
I think this is a conversation that we desperately need to have in the UK, actually. I mean, I remember Tony Blair apologising for slavery, but if we are honest, we are not of a generation where any of this history and any of the points that Cornelius is rightly challenging us on were ever taught in our schools. We didn't learn about this. We didn't learn the reality of what was done in the name of our country.
But in this conversation, do you think that in this conversation, should we apologise?
Well, yeah, but I also think it's not just about an apology. It's also about what do you do next? How do you then take responsibility and accountability for the impact that it's still having in these countries? Those are very difficult conversations. I think he's right to say we're running away from them.
Right.
But we do need to have
But you're
them.
not sure...
What should we be apologising for? What should we be recognising? I mean, this incident in Kenya that people are talking about was horrific, but it was not the only one. You know, where is the point at which... And I actually think it's quite brave and important that the King has started that conversation. Yes. But the idea that we should say, and that's the end of it.
Yeah, but
no, I think we need to have a
saying you shouldn't. We don't need to apologise because we've made, or King Charles has made, this very full expression of regret. I wasn't saying we shouldn't have that conversation.
I was merely saying that, you know, let's be clear about what you're asking him to apologise for. What he's done was addressing a particular group of incidents, which he's expressed extremely...
All right, well, we should...
Here's one of the things
I can't... No, but I think people want to know, should we apologise? They just want to hear, either you say, no, we don't need to apologise. Should we apologise for the suppression, the brutal suppression of the Mau Mau uprising in the 1950s? Yes. OK.
And we shouldn't be waiting for other countries to come to us to ask us about our own history. We probably need to do some inflection as a country and talking about what we teach our children, what we learn from those experiences and how we move forward.
I mean, Rishi Sunak has refused to apologise for UK slave trade, Harry Cole, or to pledge reparations because they would probably follow if there were apologies, saying trying to unpick our history is not the right way forward. Is he right?
I think we're very quickly getting into a different argument there about reparations and words. Look, I'm a loyal subject of the King. Who am I to question his decision? I think they found quite an elegant solution there. Yes, I agree with Stella. For the first time today,
knew we'd get there eventually.
This conversation has to be had. It's already happening. It's already happening anyway. So it should probably be had in a slightly more in a more educational environment. But at the same time, we've got to look at the context of our wider history, the history of the Commonwealth. Yeah. Look at the relative GDP, and I'm not talking necessarily about Kenya. The relative GDP of members of the Commonwealth compared to other similar countries with similar history. Look at the infrastructure in those countries. Look at the trade, for example, that we do with Kenya. Look at the brilliant crime sharing we do. When I went out with about 4 p.m. ago to there, I'm looking at the work they do on cross-border African people smuggling, on anti-pedophilia stuff, all run out of Kenya. There's a good story to tell as well as the bad.
Should we apologise for the Mau Mau uprising or putting it down?
Of course. I don't think the apology is that
contentious.
Yeah, and I think there's more here. You know, we talk about us moving on. Partly it's about people in Kenya moving on. Well, you know, we settled claims for about 20 million in 2013 with some of the victims of the Mau Mau uprising, but we've sort of resisted wider class action lawsuits. And so there's an ongoing legal fight here about what kind of reparations should happen in Kenya for specific victims. Right. But it's difficult because you're talking about the descendants of people.
Well, and how that would be calculated. Cornelius, listening to what everybody has said, if there were an apology, a formal apology by the government or King Charles, would you expect reparations to follow?
Definitely, because this is the right thing to do. It's one thing to publicly apologize and also to take necessary reparation programs or framework to ensure that we are able to bring back these people to where they were before these atrocities were meted. So it will be right that the King publicly apologizes, and then this is followed by a comprehensive reparation framework.
And when you say comprehensive, what region are you talking about in terms of the amount?
We have not computed the amounts, but this can come in form of programs that will directly impact on the victims. And this can be undertaken by involving the victims and their representatives in a way that meet their expectations.
Cornelius, would you agree with that, Stephen, to that sort of reparations outlined there?
Well, I think we'll have to see exactly what he said. He hasn't computed the numbers yet. Harry talks about class lawsuits. This is a complex area. We need to see the numbers. We need to talk about it in the whole rather than specifically like this.
That's all we have time for. Thank you to all of my guests, and I'll be back with more Politics Live at 12:15 tomorrow here on BBC Two and the iPlayer. Bye-bye.